Okay, our next speakers are going to be talking about demand, innovation, and sales and operations planning. Coming up right now is Andre Soldo as a Director of Global Supply Chain Design at Dell. Dell's been going through, as we've all read in the newspaper, a lot of reformation and change and such, and also recreating itself in an environment that has completely been transformed in the computer sector. Andre has, prior to joining Dell, was president and co-founder of a boutique consumer goods firm over in Hong Kong. So I'm sure he brings a unique perspective of how Dell should be operating. And so Andre, I'd like to welcome you up to the stage as well and give him a round of applause.
Good morning. And thank you for having me here today to speak to you from the world of Dell, which is definitely a changing world. I also want to thank Greg for pointing out the latest Gartner rankings. I won't say exactly where we ended up there, but I assure you I wasn't personally involved. The group that I work for, that I work in, is called Supply Chain Design. And I often wonder what design really means and how that's different from strategy, but we started out as a design group, and we've slowly evolved into something a little different, and we have an identity crisis in our group. We sometimes refer to ourselves as the Global Supply Chain Strategy Group. In truly inspired and insightful moments, we think of ourselves as the Strategy and Design Group, but we can't really seem to make up our mind. And there are historical reasons for that. We've been really focused on design. When the group was formed, it was about network optimization. It was about figuring out where to make things, how to get them where they need to go, and then get them into the hands of consumers. And for Dell, that was really important because the things we made were highly customized. Every computer that you bought from us was a computer that we manufactured specifically for you. But I was interested to see that some of the key topics also in Greg's speech, because we're facing the same challenges. And the challenges are all about the pace of change getting incredibly fast. And the challenges are about no longer being able to be backward looking, but having to look forward, having to be able to see what's coming at you and be ready for it ahead of time. And so over time, our group has changed. And we've actually made a very conscious decision in our group to bring in a whole bunch of strategy people. People who don't necessarily have a supply chain background at all, but people who may come from completely different industries, a lot of them from consulting, who bring a different perspective. And what I'd like to do today is to share with you how that perspective has changed at Dell, what we think the benefits of that are, and then walk through an example to try and make it a little bit more real. But before we do that, I'd actually like to take a really quick poll of the group here. We're all supply chain professionals. We're all involved in some way or another. Just by a quick show of hands, how many of you actually feel that as part of your daily jobs, you're involved in the designing of the supply chain? In some way, you make decisions that alter what the supply chain looks like. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you? There's quite a few. How many of you would say you're involved in setting the strategy for the supply chain? Also quite a few, but less. Every time we do this, there's a whole lot fewer strategy people than there are design people. And for us at Dell, we felt that when we realized that about ourselves, that this was not a way that we wanted to go forward, that this was in fact unsustainable given the pace of change and the fact that we needed to understand what was happening throughout the world in our markets. And so hopefully I can convince you that the role of strategy in the supply chain is something that needs to have a greater importance. We certainly feel that it does at Dell. As with any good strategy group, we've developed a framework, and I'd like to walk you through the framework before I go into an example. Our framework is a nice reinforcing virtual cycle. I'm sure you've seen it before, but the key point is to understand where this framework helps us think about the supply chain, how it helps us understand the supply chain and the process that we follow as a supply chain group. We start with the strategy. Historically, the strategy is always set by the corporation, the business units, largely driven by sales and by marketing. They would determine which markets to go into with what products, and they would set an agenda of what they needed from the supply chain. And we as supply chain professionals would take those needs and try to deliver against them as best as we can. Strategy changes, of course. It changes periodically because of differences in the market, because of changing dynamics with competitors. But really, the strategy at Dell was set by Dell, largely out of Austin, and largely driven by the business units. As a supply chain design group, we really got involved once the needs were defined. And we tried to understand what are the needs that this strategy places of us as a supply chain. And once we understood what the needs were, what the supply chain needed to deliver and where, we would go out and do all the things that supply chain professionals do so well. We would analyze the market. We would understand what the forces are. We would look at our competitors and figure out what are they doing well, what are they not doing well, where's their manufacturing footprint, what is their cycle time. Could we estimate how costly things were for them? We would look at other industries. We would look at consumer goods. We would look at also consumer electronics other than computers. And we would try to understand what does the optimal supply chain look like for whatever the corporate strategy wanted us to achieve. And then we would go out and we would design an infrastructure that leverages the capabilities that we have internally and potentially would also need to build some new capabilities. And we'll talk about some specifics there, but it's really about designing, given where we're at today and given where we think we need to be to deliver against the needs of the organization. And then we would also define a whole set of metrics around how that design should be implemented, over what time frame, and how it should be managed. And this is all about scorecards, the metrics, things that everyone in this room is very familiar with. We were getting pretty good at that too. We had really large scorecards. We had lots of different metrics. And eventually, those metrics would help us to manage that business. But what we ended up seeing is that when we handed over our designs to the people that actually run the supply chain, that they would get very good at running their metrics, they would measure their business, they would squeeze every last ounce of performance out of the supply chain that they were managing, and they were in fact making changes to the design because they figured out the design that was originally implemented isn't always the design that's going to be the best once it's implemented in the market. So they are continuously monitoring, they are continuously tweaking the design. And in the end, the designs that we had come up with weren't necessarily where we ended up as a company. And we saw this as a weakness of our process, because ultimately we had separated the design from the operation in some way. And so this is one of the reasons why Dell has looked at this again and is trying to understand how we can make this better. Traditionally, we would have stopped here. We would have made a design, we would have implemented it, and our operations people would have gone off and tweaked it and made it better. And the only reason that that would change is if the corporate strategy took a different turn at some point. Possibly there would be new markets that were of high importance to the company, new competitors, new products. Something would change the needs that are placed on the supply chain, and we would react to that. This was not a forward-looking way to get involved in the business. This was essentially reacting to what the business told us we needed to achieve. And so as we've thought about this and as we've built our team and as we've evolved as a supply chain strategy or design organization, we've thought about how we can be more effective in actually becoming a part of the strategy process, in looking forward rather than backwards. And we've built up our capabilities on the strategy side to achieve that. Essentially, we have a team of people now and a process in place where we look and monitor markets independently of the rest of the organization. We have a perspective from the supply chain on what's happening in the key markets that we play in. We have an understanding of new technologies. We scan the horizon and try to understand what others are doing in different geographies that we can learn from. And essentially, we have a process that we call a review of sensitivities, where we've defined a certain number of dimensions, a certain number of factors that we think we are particularly sensitive to as a company. Changes in cost, changes in tax structure, different things happening in different places that are important to the way that we do business. And we monitor them as an organization. And that allows us to have our own independent perspective. It allows us to do a lot of analysis and come up with creative solutions from the supply chain. And we believe that done well, this actually helps to create competitive advantage. We as a supply chain are now able to come to the table, the corporate strategy table, the go-to-market strategy table, and we have something to contribute to that discussion because we understand the market, we understand what we do well in these places, and we understand what the challenges will be. And we believe that by influencing what the company decides to do, we will get to a better answer. We will be more successful as Dell. We will be better at selling computers. We will be better at making them cheaply and getting them there quickly. And that's really what I want to talk about as an example today. I want to talk about making the shift from design, making the shift from reacting to the needs that are placed on the supply chain to a more proactive stance, to being a part, to earning the right to be a part of the strategy process in whatever company you work for, so that you can influence where you're going as a company and you can make sure that the supply chain can respond to that. We spent quite a lot of time thinking about this. We looked at a lot of different analogs and a lot of different examples, but two that come to mind, one good, one bad recently, and that we studied at quite some detail, are Amazon and Boeing. Amazon is somebody who we look towards as doing this very, very well. They started out as a retailer, an online retailer of books. In order to be able to deliver their books, they had to build a supply chain, not a particularly complicated one at first, that was able to deliver anywhere in America, eventually in other countries as well. They realized very quickly that the supply chain was a key component of their business. They realized that they had built expertise in their designs that they could leverage into other businesses. And by being a part of that strategic conversation at Amazon, the supply chain was able to become one of their key competitive advantages. Today, Amazon is as much a logistics company as it is a retailer, and that's largely because the supply chain was able to influence where the business is going and was able to build entire new businesses around their strengths and capabilities. On the flip side, we look from a very outside-in perspective at what's happened to Boeing as it's tried to bring to market a very complex new product in the 787 Dreamliner, and we see a breakdown in how the supply chain participated in that strategy. To us, it looks like the supply chain has always been playing catch-up at Boeing. Like the sales organization and the engineering organization perhaps designed a product that the supply chain wasn't quite ready for and placed requirements on the supply chain that they're constantly trying to catch up with but haven't quite gotten there. And it's resulted in continuous delays and a lot of product problems. Again, that's an outside-in perspective. We didn't have the benefit of going to Boeing and seeing how they actually did it, but we've got case studies on many different companies, and we believed that we were going down that path ourselves. And so we're very passionate, at least in our group, about ensuring that we get to be a part of the corporate strategy conversation. And we work very hard to earn that right. And we've been quite successful at it. What I'd like to do is just to share with you the example of China, where we've done a lot of things in the market in the last couple of years. China is clearly a focus market for most companies. It certainly is for Dell. And we've had some very clear strategic initiatives in China, which we as a supply chain were a part of. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time today to walk you through what that looked like and to give a little bit of flavor to our framework. So in China, we started with some guidance and some new corporate strategy that came to us from the business unit as well as from our sales and marketing colleagues. It was clear that our growth trajectory in China was slowing from where we were initially, and it was clear that the market is developing in a different place than where we were playing. Dell was very strong in its distribution in tier 1 to 3 cities, but we were seeing the growth coming in the future from tier 4 to 6 cities. And we weren't very well developed as a supply chain to be able to access that market. So for us to be able to continue and maintain our growth trajectory as we had planned, the clear message came from our colleagues that we needed to find a way to do that. And so we went into this reactive mode that I spoke about earlier. We have a clear need. We need to figure out how are we going to distribute to tier 4 to 6 cities and do it competitively and at a cost that we can accept. We did what all good supply chain professionals do. We went out and we looked at as many metrics and as much analytics as we could in China to understand the market and understand our own capabilities and what it would take for us to get there, to get to a tier 4 to 6 city in an efficient way. And we came up with a design. We came up with a recommendation of how we should change the supply chain that we have today and make it something that was more in tune with the need for serving these more disparate cities in China. We also defined the metrics that we needed to have in place to be able to execute against that plan, and then we handed it over to our enablement colleagues who always appreciate it when we give them a fancy design and then hand it to them and leave. They enabled it. We started monitoring it, and we realized that it wasn't really performing as we were hoping that it would. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that we weren't getting the cycle times that we thought we should be getting, and that there was something wrong with the design that we had come up with. Something wasn't working properly. And much to their credit, our supply chain and ops people that were in charge of this were able to identify what was wrong with it and do what they do best. They were able to fix it. But as a supply chain design organization, we understood that that was not the most efficient way to go about this, and that there was a mistake somewhere in our process. And we went back and we tested this model of strategy that we were working on at the time to develop. And we really got to the point where we understood where we had gone wrong. Because the market in China moves so quickly and things are changing really on a monthly basis that a lot of the design work we had done was backward looking. We weren't really in a position to put in place something that answered the needs that the company had placed on us. And it was because we weren't really looking forward. We weren't anticipating what was going to happen. We were reacting to what we thought the situation was. And in a world where the pace of change is getting to be so fast, in a world where developing markets are becoming more and more important for our growth, and markets that are especially dynamic, we felt our organization wasn't really having the influence that it should. And so we went back and we looked at China in a much more rigorous way and on a much different level. We really did a thorough study of the markets, the forces at play, where we saw things going, and we mapped our capabilities against that expectation. And we came up with a series of additional recommendations that were fundamentally changing the way that Dell would do business in China. And we brought that analysis to our colleagues, and we discussed it with them, and much to our surprise, there was a huge appetite for that kind of strategic thinking within that forum. We were able to bring a certain rigor and a certain analytical approach that had a different perspective because we had an operational perspective. We didn't have the sales view and we didn't have the marketing view. And brought together, that actually came up with an answer that has been much more successful for us in China and that is being implemented now and that we look to as one of our case studies of great success. So I'll go through just a couple of examples of each of those phases of our framework. The first is how sales and how the company actually came to focus on tier 4 to 6 cities. I don't think it's a particularly big secret that tier 4 to 6 cities are where the growth is in the future in China. It's more than half the growth, more than half the volume that we expect to see in China is going to be much more distributed. The data is publicly available, obviously, and it was pretty clear from a sales and marketing perspective that we needed to focus on this segment. What wasn't so clear is what it really takes to win in that segment and what the fundamental differences are on the consumer, on the pricing, on the product that you would have to offer in those areas. Some of that detail was missing when the original decision was made that this was what we needed to focus on. As we were thinking about the design, we did many, many things. We obviously looked at our own current capabilities. That's where we always start. And one of the key things that we look at, obviously, is cycle time, cost, and our competitiveness on both of those dimensions. So we did a tremendous study around all of our cycle time throughout China to understand where was our cycle time competitive, where was it not competitive, and where did the tier 4 to 6 cities and regions fit in, and then where were the holes in our network. It turns out there were some pretty significant holes in our network, and the amount of effort that we would need to exert to get to tier 4, 6 cities was pretty significant. We also did a lot of competitive analysis around what our competitors were doing in their supply chains in China, what was the business model and the go-to-market strategy that they had, and how did we compete currently and how do we expect to compete in the future. As I mentioned earlier, we also looked at other industries. We did a lot of work, and we thought we had done a fairly decent job of actually having had a holistic view of what it would take. And so we came up with a design that essentially said that we needed a couple of additional sortation and fulfillment centers. We have a lot of manufacturing facilities in China that are in different regions. We came up with new routings and new ways of shipping product from those. We shifted around where we manufactured things to try and bring them a little closer to tier 4 and 6 cities. And we did a lot of tweaking of the existing supply chain in China. And then we went off and we implemented it, and our colleagues put it into play. Part of the design was a segmentation, so our fulfillment model actually shifted to 3 different ways of getting to our customer. At Dell, we always have a direct model in the markets that we're truly committed to and that we're really focusing on. There was a huge retail segment in China for our products, and so we had a separate supply chain that we designed for that. And then we also, of course, use a lot of distributors in the more remote regions of China, and we had a different supply chain that we designed for that. Each of those segments had its own set of metrics that we tracked. We had goals that we had aligned with for each of those. We had targets that we believed we needed to hit to be successful. And as we went to execute, we discovered that we weren't meeting a lot of those targets. And our operations people were coming back to us and saying, this design isn't really working because it's fundamentally flawed. And what they ended up doing in a very short term and very quickly is to understand why it was fundamentally flawed. Where was it failing? And how do we fix it? And my group wasn't directly involved in that. We had done the initial design. We had decided that that was the right answer. And it was up to them to fix it. And much to their credit, they did. They added additional sortation centers in different locations. And they were able to reroute and use an entirely different trucking infrastructure in China, essentially, where they were able to get lower cost and better cycle time than our original plan had called for. But that made us think. That made us realize that somewhere this process wasn't really working for us. And so we went back to the drawing board. We looked at where we had gone wrong, and we tried to figure out what was it in our analysis that wasn't really answering the needs of the company. And what we came to, the conclusion we came to, is that what was really flawed was our understanding of the needs, first and foremost. Because we weren't at the table when the needs were defined, we didn't really understand what it was that we were designing for. We were told what we needed to deliver, but we didn't understand why we had to deliver those things and what were the factors that were influencing that decision. So that's the first thing we did, is we actually went back and we looked at the markets and we looked at consumer behavior and we looked at products and what products are desired in the marketplace and then in tier 4, 6 cities versus others. We really did a fundamental market study, which really isn't that related to the supply chain at all, but we did it because we needed to understand why those needs and were those the right needs. And we ended up realizing that there were some things that were very different and that were fundamentally different that we weren't really aware of. The first thing that we came to realize is that an inventory-based stocking model actually has some very fundamental advantages, especially in China, especially if you're going after tier 4 to 6 cities. It was counterintuitive to us because we're not used to doing an inventory model. We're used to building a custom unit with whatever you want in it. And that wasn't going to work in tier 4 to 6 cities because no matter what we did from a design perspective, we simply weren't going to be able to compete with others who had stock in the regions and who were able to get it out to the more disparate parts of China very quickly. And so we built an entire business case around what it would take to do stocking in China and how we would get there as a supply chain organization. But that wasn't the whole picture, of course, because the decision to do stocking is a huge decision for someone like Dell who don't have that as part of their fundamental DNA. This was not a decision that the supply chain organization was going to be able to drive or decide on. But we certainly were able to bring it to the table. We were able to convince colleagues with our analytics around the fact that stocking had fundamental operational advantages. It was still up to them to understand and to decide whether it had sales advantages and whether it really fit with the overall corporate strategy. But we raised the point and we made it into a forum and into a discussion where we had that conversation. And we were part of the decision-making process. And as a result of that, we understood what the needs were that came out of that decision-making process and what the trade-offs were across all the different functions. And that led to a much better answer looking forward in China rather than looking backwards. We did some other things as well. We also understood that having retail outlets in China is actually fundamentally critical to succeeding. And while our sales colleagues knew that, we at the supply chain weren't really directly involved on the retail side of the business at all. We provided product, obviously. It was mostly done regionally. And from a centralized supply chain perspective, we really had no understanding of the retail market in China or the fact of how these retail stores operate. As a part of the conversation we were having around stocking, the sales and marketing organization in the local business unit in China actually invited us to become a part of their conversation around retail stores. And we worked jointly with them to develop the retail strategy, which leverages a lot of the key advantages that we have in China. And as a result of that, I do believe we came to a much better answer around what our retail strategy needs to look like to win in tier 4 to 6 cities in China. And so the key message here for us really is that as a group, we've evolved away a little bit from design, which we continue to do because we have to, because that is part of the business. We obviously have to figure out where we make things, how we get them to where they need to go, and how we get them into the hands of consumers. But we need to be more forward-looking than that in the new world that we're facing, especially in developing markets in Asia and in Europe and in other parts of the world. And as a result, we've brought in the resources and we're spending the effort to be a part of the conversation around the go-to-market strategies in these countries and to bring real valuable analytics and insight and creativity from an operations perspective to the process in the hope that we can influence where the company is going, what the market strategy will be, and what we need to deliver as a supply chain. So just to sum it all up and to give you a little bit of a roadmap, if this is something that you're looking at to achieving within your organization, we've created a basic set of metrics around how we're performing against these goals. And at a very high level, they're across the 4 dimensions of our framework. So we think of it as earning the right to play in the strategy game. And the more of these capabilities that we develop, the greater our ability to earn that right. The more we will be respected in that forum, the more we'll be able to influence it. And we're not perfect in this process by any means, but we're certainly developing that muscle. We're getting there, and we're trying to figure out how to get better all the time. The first thing you need to do is you need to understand the strategy. You need to be able to know why the needs are what they are to be able to respond to them. The second thing is around the design. You need to be able to have the right design at the right time. These are still core capabilities. These are not new things. You just need to be able to do them really well. So you need to have the right strategy. You need to have the right design. You need to be able to manage it. You need to be able to understand, is it working, isn't it working, and how do we fix it to make sure that it continues to do what it needs to do. But for us, the key dimension is you need to be able to help transform. You need to be forward-looking. You need to understand where as an organization you may be headed and what the implications of that are. And as a result of that, you need to be able to participate in the key conversations that will result in that supply chain transformation. And I think as a group, we've gotten pretty good at that. We've obviously still got a ways to go. But really, that's the key message for us, and that's our focus as a supply chain strategy organization, is to be part not only of operations strategy, but corporate strategy altogether, to help guide where we as Dell go in these various markets where the supply chain challenges can be quite significant. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for listening. And any questions?